Universities have historically held and acquired collections of First Nations cultures in various iterations, such as art, archives, and cultural material. Increasingly, these collections have been employed for reconnection and reconciliation, uncovering old perspectives, and creating new narratives that utilise interdisciplinary approaches with First Nations perspectives to amplify the voices of the makers. The Voicing the Living Archive, working with First Nations collections in higher education symposium, was held at the University of Canberra on July the 18th and 19th, 2024. It highlighted some recent projects that focus and examine First Nations collections across different areas of universities, from research to teaching. The event was organised by Dr. Wendy Somerville, Hakim Rahim Abdul and Katie Hain of the University of Canberra, and supported by the International Council of Museums Committee for University Museums and Collections and the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra.
Research affiliate at the Chow Chow Queen Museum at the University of Sydney. All of you don't know already, you should. Chow Chow Queen, University of Sydney. He has an extensive experience in working with higher education museums and collections in different Australian universities. He's the editor of the University Museums and Collections Journal and has published widely, including the recent book, The Museum and Collections of Higher Education, published last year. He's the current chair of UMAC, which is the University and Museums Collection and International Committee of the Global Museum Network, ICOM. So please welcome Andrew for his talk.
Thank you very much, Harkham, and thank you very much for the wonderful acknowledgement of country this morning. Welcome to country this morning, I should say. It was very interesting to hear. It's always interesting for a non-Indigenous person to travel to other countries and to hear something about other places in Australia, and also to actually learn something or get some sort of sense. And it was very warm welcome indeed. And anyway, so I'd like to just acknowledge that the elders, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. Okay, so as Harkham has mentioned, my name's Andrew Simpson, and I'm tied up with a couple of really colonial organisations, universities and museums. As a matter of fact, I think, as we got a sense from Sandy earlier on, they don't get any more colonial than that. So I'm the current chair of UMAC, which is the International Committee for University Museums and Collections. And Sandy said some fantastic things this morning, particularly about the murkiness of collections in the university space. And I'm sure hopefully we'll get to explore some of these topics later on this afternoon. But murkiness is really interesting. But I'd like to also follow on from what Sandy said, just very briefly as a slight diversion, is to poke fun at Macquarie University again, because it's one of my favourite pastimes, poking fun at Macquarie University. But also, Macquarie has one of the most amazingly colonial heritage items, and it's really weird. It's actually a recreation of Lachlan Macquarie's lounge room in Scotland that he never got to because he died on the way or something. And this actually sits in the entrance of the university's library. And, you've got to ask why. What's it doing there? I mean, you can ask a whole lot of other questions as well. But, when you were talking about the politics of whimsy too, well, sometimes unintentional humour is the most effective. Anyway, that's a diversion. Anyway, let's talk about the university and the museum. Institutions that are all about knowledge and power derived from the European Enlightenment and carried to all corners of the world by different versions of European imperialism. And in doing so, Western Enlightenment knowledge, which, as we all know, is extractive, based on dispassionate observation and empiricism, marginalised all the other knowledge systems around the world, marginalised and displaced all the other knowledge systems around the world. The university and the museum are the most colonial of organisations. And it may not be possible for them to be decolonised, but we're undergoing a project that we're just sort of starting at the moment to sort of see if that is possible, to see how we could do it. Here's a little bit about UMAC and what it stands for. Oh, there's two bits to that. Basically, UMAC is a group that advocates for the value of collections in higher education. Now, that again is linked to some of the things that was said before. I mean, how are these collections used? The amazing thing about collections in universities, in the academy, is sometimes, well, quite often, people just don't know what's there. And, you know, even university leadership groups sometimes have not the foggiest idea of what sort of collections are sort of being kept in their name. So it's interesting. And a couple of years ago, we were sort of interested in this idea. A couple of years ago, had a discussion with some Aboriginal academics, and they pointed out to me that back in the 1980s, collections were first being, well, questions were being asked of universities. You know, you've got all these Indigenous collections in your, what have you got? Why have you got it? How are you using them? And things like that. And the original response I was told from the universities was, well, none of your business. You know, so what? Who are you to be asking what sort of things we have here? But luckily, things have changed a fair bit since then. We have sort of actually moved on a bit, I think. And a couple of years ago, we put together a webinar that was to look at Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander cultural materials in museums and university collections, and some of the global issues of repatriation and restitution. And it was made up with a number of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars. It was an interesting conversation. And after that, we as a group in UMAC, and again, with more sort of conversations and discussions, produced this sort of set of guidelines that was actually intended for universities, particularly for the university management, on the way they can approach what they should be doing with collections that they hold on to, which they might not be using, which they might not even know they have. First thing to do, of course, is to find out exactly what you do have. And that's just very much general sort of guidance, common sense sort of guidance. And what we're finding is, since this has happened, there are actually a number of processes of repatriation and restitution going on associated with university museums around the world. And this is a global issue because both these colonial organisations are global types of organisations. So we're also preparing an issue of our journal, and the issue of the journal will have a few case studies in it of, you know, where there's been some form of repatriation or some sort of form of change. And what we've intentionally done with these case studies is just look at telling both the university side and the source community side as well. So that's the only sort of type of repatriation we're sort of interested in as far as publishing it as an article is concerned. And there's a lot of interesting stories going on. There are some sort of good things happening at long last, and we have come a bit further down the track from originally just saying, well, it's none of your business, you should not be concerned. And one of the great stories is, of course, the Kamei fishing spears from the point of first contact between colonisers and the colonised, a story that's actually bracketed by two different university museums on either side of the world. That's not only about the return of cultural objects, but it's also about the survival of knowledge, as is evidenced by artefacts made in exactly the same way. And that shows you an image of the original artifacts and also an image of recently made artifacts. And it's interesting, it's a wonderful story about the Kamei spears, because even though I think 3 of them ended up in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, I think Cook's diary says there was something like about 300 actually collected, and who knows where the other 297 are. And it's remarkable. It's not so much a matter of collecting, it was more a matter of disarmament. Even, you know, it's a different sort of a process. But a lot of these things end up in museums or universities. Why? Because museums and universities collect this sort of stuff. It might be useful. We might be able to use them for research or teaching. A lot of the issues that Sandy's already sort of pointed out about. Okay, then we had our annual conference last year at Sydney University, and we decided to pick to sort of feature 3 Indigenous scholars as our keynotes. And it was a very, very interesting kind of a conversation. And it kind of brought up one of the things that really struck people at the meeting was, I think it was an estimate made by Gay Sculthorpe that there's something like, and this is just an estimate, and she's worked in the UK for a while, came up with the figure of 39,000 Australian Indigenous objects in UK universities, in UK museums. That's just a massive displacement of material, and it's hard to sort of even get your head around the amount of material that we're actually talking about. Okay, and this represents, and this is because this is the Western Enlightenment knowledge system, if you like, the technology of decontextualizing objects, taking them out of their original setting and recontextualizing them in a different setting, the setting of the museum. Okay, so the globalization of the Enlightenment means that all of this has happened all over the world, and that the knowledge or epistemology is recorded in the shape and designs of cultural objects and visual representations are important because they represent diversity. They represent diverse ways of understanding the world. They, in other words, represent diverse knowledge systems. So there's a lot of that material has been sort of collected and is displaced. Here's sort of 3 examples just to sort of emphasise the global nature of the issue of the Colonial Museum. Specific cultural knowledge is embedded in these 3 designs here: Omi bark cloth from Papua New Guinea, Trewa silk from Thailand, and Maori designs from New Zealand. And when you ask knowledge holders or source community people, should this material actually be in museums? Sometimes you'll get told no, it should be back with community. And other times you will occasionally hear them say yes, but only, under certain conditions. And usually the reason why source communities might say, yes, maybe they could be in museums, is they say that having this stuff there is kind of like a form of cultural diplomacy, which is an interesting sort of a concept. And there's a number of stories of this too, which I won't sort of go into now, of collections that have been made accidentally and now sort of end up, because of other disasters that subsequently happened, being the only cultural representation of a group of people hidden away in the basement of museums around the world. Okay, so this slide here captures the and summarises the project's intention. Two-way museology across institutional and multi-knowledge system exploration. And the project takes its starting point from the fact that displaced collections and university museums have the potential to actually be windows on multiple knowledge systems. In other words, different ways of understanding the world. But can an Enlightenment technology truly represent different ways of knowing the world? That's a big question. Some people would say no, some people would say yes. But the idea of trying to incorporate different epistemologies inside the museum technology, if you like, really is the ultimate test of inclusion or inclusivity for the museum. If a museum as a technology is only capable of representing one knowledge system, a Western European knowledge system, then really is it any sort of use as a technology? Anyway, so interesting sort of bigger questions there. Now, and there's already some very interesting work going on, and there is a bit of a sense of change going on around the world. And a lot of museum groups say that they are decolonising. And you ask museum people, well, what do you mean by decolonising? And everyone will come up with a different sort of a view as to what that's going on. But here's some interesting stuff that's going on in terms of using object-based learning to introduce Aboriginal knowledge. Now, this obviously is not going to give you deep insights into Indigenous cosmologies or Indigenous ways of thinking, but it is going to at least give non-Indigenous people some sort of a flavour or sense of different ways of looking at the world. And here's another project that we've just started up, one that Wendy mentioned earlier on, with a group called the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, which is a private university in India that actually does education all the way through from primary through to tertiary education. And they are specifically interested in working with this particular group are actually interested in developing their own pedagogy museum. So we've been discussing with them, okay, well, what sort of things would you include in a museum that is meant to exemplify your culture? And what would you choose and why? And there's some interesting conversations going on there. There's a Indigenous architect who's talking to them from Sydney University, Michael Mossman, who's talking to them, and they're looking at building a museum, a pedagogy museum from the ground up, which is purely focused on Indigenous cultures. Okay, so some interesting work going on. And there are also groups who are looking at, okay, and this is being done by both Indigenous scholars and non-Indigenous scholars. How can we look at the balance between, or the relationship between epistemology and pedagogy? How can we sort of draw out any sort of general principles for this? Can we incorporate other ways of teaching in what we do as a higher education institution and things like that? Then, of course, it's really interesting. And there's other things going on too in the sector. There's some universities themselves that are even looking at changing their structure, which is really interesting in itself. And QUT, for example, have this new faculty, I think, of Indigenous knowledge, as it's called. And there are other universities setting up sort of similar structures. And that at least is a sort of a willingness, I guess, to possibly attempt some form of change. Whether it's actually going to be anything of lasting value, who knows? But it's quite sort of fascinating. Okay, where are we? Yeah. Then there's individual groups who are doing interesting work, and this is one that I'm particularly keen on. It's the Gondwana Corporation, which is an artist-led initiative developing augmented reality and virtual reality museum experiences to convey a sense of Yolngu Aboriginal knowledge. And they've already done exhibitions at a number of museums around Australia. And the reason why they're doing this is specifically because they want to actually show their own members of the Yolngu community different ways of sort of knowing the world, and they kind of want their kids to be brought up knowing that there are two ways of knowledge. It's interesting with this sort of a change of sort of trying to present different ways of knowing. Some writers have even suggested that maybe we need a different term. The university shouldn't be called the university because that's sort of is focused on the one way of knowledge. Some people have even using the term pluriversity as an organisation that involves a number of different a number of different knowledge systems. Okay, so this is basically an open-ended investigation. There's lots of other interesting things that are done too. A very simple thing that can be done that any museum or gallery can do, and that's to invite Indigenous scholars or Indigenous activists in to reinterpret an exhibition. And this is something that we regularly try and do at Macquarie, but we haven't done it to the Lachlan Macquarie room yet. Maybe we should. Maybe we actually need some sort of intervention there. Might be new. Okay, so Yeah, so basically all UNAT's trying to do as a group is kind of be a bit of a focus for this kind of work. We would simply like to sort of see more of this kind of work being done, because I think that a lot of this change can actually be driven by universities. And, you know, it would involve things like exhibition work that needs to happen, and it can happen in a whole lot of different ways. Exhibition work through co-creation, through collaboratively designed education programs, online resources, even virtual reality experiences, but dependent on the collaborative participation of different partners. And these can be any partners at all. We think that what we can do as a group, as UMAC, is look at promoting that to universities to say, look at the interesting things that can be done if we actually use the collections correctly, and if we use them collaboratively with knowledge holders of relevant to those collections, etc. So, look, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you for your kind attention. Hopefully I've given you a bit of a sense. There's a number of the partners involved. That's only some of them, but we also always recommend or welcome other partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Time for one or two questions, if anybody has a question to ask.
I just wanted to make a comment about how well the Chow Chuck does community engagement in relation to allowing people to work with collections. And I'd been in there when it was quite closed at the Macleay, and now it invites community to talk, including myself. I've been in there and done a couple of talks to work with collections, to collaborate with them with collections. And I think that's a really exceptional way of doing things that you don't see a lot in other universities.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment, because there was a deliberate effort. It took a long campaign of both philanthropy and university investment to develop the Chow Chuck Wing Museum, but it was all about getting the collections much more better and much more appropriately used than what they were sort of hidden away in different sort of discipline areas. Yeah, hidden away within the colonial structure of the university, actually, and bring it into a central place and invite communities in and invite collaboration in. So yeah, it'd be great to see similar things happening in many other universities. Yeah.
Yeah, Macquarie can take a leaf out of their
Macquarie could take a leaf out of their book, but Macquarie don't seem to be interested in anything other than biomedical stuff at the moment for some reason. Anyway.
So just one more question from Sandy.
I think I'd challenge that. First of all, it's kind of the challenge to the QUT stuff too. Sorry, it's us doing that. It's Indigenous academics that have led that. They haven't permitted us to do it. We've insisted on it. Of course it will transform things. Of course it will change, because it's not non-Indigenous people forcing this. That's the point. You know, so, you know, the whole maybe it'll work. I mean, the pluriversity stuff, sorry, nobody's using that. Nobody's using it. They won't even change their names from Sydney and Macquarie. They're hardly going to stop calling themselves universities or thinking about it differently. They're not. We have to force it. The only way it works is forcing it. But I guess the other thing is, you know, you were talking about, you know, speaking to non-Indigenous students. Indigenous students too, you know, they're the audience too. And I think they should be the primary audience for this, you know, and I think it's powerful when that happens. You know, I think there's genuine power in that. But I mean, universities are not going to give permission. We take it and we do massive amount of work to make that happen. And it is happening. I mean, genuinely it's happening. And, you know, are there still these resistances? Yeah. But also we've got to just call it for nonsense, you know, otherwise nothing will ever change and they'll continue to be doing this nonsense, you know. And I think what QUT is doing is remarkable, and it's led by some remarkable people. And I think the same at Macquarie. I think you have distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson just breaking down every barrier, and it's working. You know, might be small, but that doesn't mean smaller investment, even smaller activity can still be really powerful on the national stage. But more importantly, it can be powerful for Indigenous students going through. And I think that's the big shift that's happened. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And look, I don't sort of have any issue with what you're saying. It does have to be driven by Indigenous scholars.
Yeah.
And yeah, there
It
are
is
some
being,
barriers there. And you know, the barriers of the sort of colonial nature of the institution. Yeah, so yeah, no, I'm not.
But I don't think we're going to change it.
Everything
I don't think we're going to change it to some other fantasy. And of course, universities are not European. You know, they didn't start in Europe. That isn't their, you know, there is a reimagining them as a. No, sure. Well, maybe. But again, the resistances that's just the centralized thought, is the public imaginary of it. And we've got to do resistances to it. I think it's the only way that we can do more work. So, yeah.
Oh, one last question.
So I'll try and speak up. I'd actually say as a next generation Aboriginal academics, like I have to acknowledge you, I have to acknowledge Wendy. I mean, Wendy is the second PhD. There was a thing that she was first, didn't Tess? Third. So even with that, but with our collection, I've had the ability to say, open the doors. It's because of these people who have come before me and knocked on the doors, and necessarily they opened. But me as a student, I'm basically allowed to kick open the door because of not only being a student, but secondly, that be a custodian. And I have to thank Wendy because she's actually found out a different way. I'm just not an Aboriginal student. This stuff is on my land. I have a responsibility. And just to go in, what actually hurt me and got the drive is I lived in Northern Territory, and we'll go into that in detail, but I knew stuff. And then I walked in and I saw a sacred men's hair ball sitting right next to a woman's dance stick. They were from the same nation, from the same community. And it actually took my breath away. And all I thought, if this was on their nation, no way, but it's on mine. So this is my work. And this is why, once again, I'm really honoured, because I'm sitting in the rooms that have knocked on the door, that have demanded more and had said no more. And because of that, I'm able to walk through, and just wanted to acknowledge that. And we need to keep that ball rolling, because what will the third generation of these scholars do? What will the fourth generation? You know, this is continuous culture. This is what 65,000 years mean of working for our peoples in a modern setting. I like to call myself a contemporary matriarch warrior, because I can't go back and do traditional cultural stuff, but I can do cultural stuff right here, right now.